Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you today. For family reasons, you've probably been told I'm not able to be at the service, although I was down to speak. And so I've recorded the talk that I was going to be giving, which John's going to play back to you now. So hopefully that's all going to work all right. So today we're starting a new series, a kind of back to basics with a little bit of a twist, looking at what we really believe in, lifting our eyes above the current situation to a God that is greater than us and a power that's bigger than everything we can imagine at present. As part of that series, we're also going to link it in to some of the songs that we sing and think a little bit critically about the way in which we use those songs and the way in which we can improve our use of them to aid us in worship. So hopefully there's going to be a bit in this talk for everybody, a little bit of new stuff, a little bit of old stuff, a little bit of concentration on what we've always heard but perhaps haven't thought of too carefully for a while. I'm going to start off today's talk. I've called it How Great Thou Art. It's really looking at the grandeur of God, the greatness of God, the God of Creator, the Creator God. And we'll be reflecting a little bit on the song How Great Thou Art a bit later on in the session. But to start with, I would like to tell you a story. This talk overall, there's going to be one or two little bits of reminiscing from me. I hope that won't come too tediously for you. But the first bit of reminiscing is thinking of all the children at home at the moment and trying to entertain themselves. I can remember being at home when I was probably 3 or 4 years old. We didn't have nurseries and playgroups. And in the afternoon, my mum used to sit me down to Listen with Mother, which was 15 minutes before the Archers every afternoon. There would always be a song and then there'd be a story. And the lady telling the story always used to say, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." So that's what I'm going to do for you today. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a slightly macabre story, but hopefully it will become clear as to why I'm telling you that as we go through. So are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Once upon a time, a long time ago, before the heavens and the earth existed, Apsu was the god of fresh water and Tiamat was the goddess of salt water. Their waters mingled and they produced younger gods. These younger gods were unruly and troublesome, and when the senior gods plotted destruction on the unruly mob that they had produced, Ea, one of the younger ones, killed Apsu and made his home in his dead body. Tiamat plotted revenge on Ea and Marduk, his brother, who helped him, and a battle followed. During that battle, Tiamat was killed and Marduk sliced her body in two. The detail is macabre and revolting, and I'm not going to go into that, but he sliced her body in two to create the heavens and the earth, and he fashioned humankind from Tiamat's new but now dead husband to serve the gods and do their work. What a story. When I first read that, I was like, well, I read it in more detail and was fairly disgusted with it. It turns out it's a Mesopotamian creation poem, which was written down in the ancient Babylonian era, probably around 1800 BC. It was a kind of poem, and it was called, I'm just going to check the name, Enuma Elish, and it was written down around about the 1800 BC in the sort of Mesopotamian area. Interestingly enough, when it does have a few kind of connections with the Genesis chapter 1 story, which we had read to us earlier, where we hear of God creating the heavens and the earth. The Mesopotamian creation story is about the heavens and the earth being created and humankind, but from a very, very different perspective to the Genesis one. The Genesis account brings hope, peace, confidence, and shows a good God reigning supreme over a good world, with people created to work with him in caring for it, not as his slaves, as in the ancient Babylonian story, but as his friends. There are no battles in the Genesis story for supremacy, and God is shown as the one true God who simply calls creation into being. There are two accounts in Genesis. Genesis 1 is pretty much from God's perspective, which is what we're focusing on today. You could say Genesis chapter 2 is more from man's, but we're going to leave that for today. We're just going to look at Genesis chapter 1. Interesting, this was written down probably around about the time, probably after the Babylonian story was written down. And quite possibly the writers were trying to show the Hebrew God as they had experienced him, as being a much better, a good and a positive creator God. So the story tells us that God saw that his creation was good. It wasn't perfect, which is a Greek word. It was good, which is a Hebrew word. Perfect means it would have been fully formed and complete, and therefore it couldn't change, because if it changed, that would mean it wasn't perfect in the first place. So it was a kind of static sterility. The Hebrew word good means it has the potential to create more goodness. So God's world is an ongoing creative process. Nothing is mentioned in Genesis chapter 1 of Beethoven's Ninth, the Mona Lisa, E=mc², St. Paul's Cathedral. I could go on. All of those things were there potentially and gradually came into being in the future. And this forms the story. This Genesis chapter 1 forms the beginning of the story that we in 2020 now find ourselves in. So let's have a look a little bit at the world that God has created. So going through the different sections in that reading, at the beginning, day 1, God created light and dark. There was a distinction between the two, giving day and night. Day 2, verses 9 and 10, talk about the waters separating out the land and the sea. Day 3, we see the introduction of plant life of all sorts. Day 4, we get lights in the sky, constellations, stars in the galaxies in the sky. Day 5, we get living creatures being introduced, all living creatures, land and sea. And finally on day 6, we get humankind, we get people being created. Just as a note here though, just as contrasting accounts of creation show the Genesis God as creative, loving, compassionate, and desiring a relationship with his created people who are friends and not slaves, so this account also shows why and not how God created the earth. So I'm not going to commentate on the fact that it says 6 days, and it could be 6 days or it could be 13 billion years, or how things might have come into being, because that completely misses the point. Let me tell you another story, another bit of reminiscing. Here, I have my mum's old cookbook. And somewhere in here, there are lots of recipes, but here we've got a recipe for a sponge sandwich, a Victoria sandwich. Now, my mum was a really good cook and very hospitable, and ever since being a child, I can remember her using this book and other books and creating fabulous food for us. My father, on the other hand, was an amazing man, but completely incapable of cooking anything. He could make tea, cups of tea, but that was about it. He was a science professor before he died, but before that, when I was younger, when round about the time my mother was using that Bureau cookbook, my father wrote this book called The Physics and Chemistry of Baking, in which he explained and described the chemistry that goes on, the chemical reactions that occur when you bake a cake. Now, if you want to know how to make a Victoria sandwich, you go to this, and it tells you how many grams of sugar, in fact, it probably says ounces actually, sugar, fat, eggs, flour, whatever you need to put in the cake, how to mix it up, what number to cook it on, and all that sort of stuff. This book tells you none of that, but it tells you how the cake comes into being. Which of these is true? My father could say his book is true because he explains how it happens. My mother could say Hers is true because it explains what to do. Actually, they're both true. Neither of them, however, are mentioned in the Genesis account, but they're still both true. They're not mutually incompatible. They're telling us different things. So my take on the Genesis story is that it's telling us why God created the world. It's not telling us how he actually did it. And it's telling us what he did. He actually created all of the things that I've mentioned just now, but he doesn't tell us exactly how he does them. You may have heard of Francis Collins. He was interviewed on the radio, I think just last week, on the news programme on Radio 4 last week in the morning. But he is very well known internationally. He's the leader of the Human Genome Project, which was the first attempt to determine the entire, unsuccessful attempt to determine the entire DNA sequence of the human genome. As a young man, he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. But one day he was sitting at the bedside of a seriously ill patient, and the patient asked him what he believed in. And he suddenly realised that he didn't believe in God, but he'd reached that particular belief position without looking at any of the evidence, and he was supposed to be a scientist. Scientists are supposed to look at the evidence and draw conclusions. And Francis Collins realised he'd come to a conclusion without looking at any of the evidence. And he actually says, I was supposed to be a scientist. Given the many pointers one sees around oneself in terms of the universe and it having a beginning and its fine-tuning, so the way in which all those constraints which determine the behaviour of matter and energy seem to have been set just on a certain very precise range to make life possible, that evidence, when he looked at it, drew him to the conclusion that there is a creator God. We're going to pause for a moment. I'm going to pause and ask John to show you just a 1 minute video clip off YouTube called The Powers of 10. It doesn't have any commentary. It's just got some photography, which just helps put into perspective some of the things that Francis Collins was actually talking about when he talked about looking at the evidence in creation around him, which convinced him that there was a God. So let's just pause for a moment and watch that clip.